Hello Proponomics people, and welcome to the supply pipeline video number 2, sub-pillar of auctions. So I personally have bought a 3-figure number of properties at auction and also have disposed of a number of properties through auction as well. Done a few flips and trades in my time, although generally speaking have gone to auction to try and buy, to hold on and build a portfolio. So what do I want to tell you about auctions today? Well, let's start with the fact that you have to be careful in the auction environment. I always think of the auction like a casino. There's been all these things set up to try and make you make bad decisions, to chase your losses or to chase those bids if you're getting outbid on something. And one of the rules you absolutely have to follow is work out your maximum before you go and stick to it. One of the other rules you have to follow is don't just start bidding on something else you haven't even looked at properly or closely because you lost out on the lot before or the lot before that. You come, you do what you're going to do. Some auctions we've bought 5 or 6 when things have gone really well. Some auctions we've analysed 25 or 30 properties and we've bought nothing at all. And that's just the way that it is, and that needs to be the way that it is. You have to keep your discipline in order to be useful and good in auction. So I'm going to split auction now into 3 separate parts: pre or before the auction, at the auction, and then post or after the auction. So the temptation with auctions is to look at them and think, right, well, it's only one day, but realistically that really does a disservice to the auctioneer apart from anything else. They're going through the book building process for weeks and weeks beforehand, and they've constantly got marketing funnels out there trying to get stock that they can auction off. And of course, as soon as that stock is what we call lotted in the auction game, as soon as it's allocated a lot number, it's there in the mixer, able to be bought. And in fact, proactive auction houses might be phoning investors that they know because perhaps they've got a vendor who actually really needs it to sell and wouldn't mind taking an offer before the auction. That might be 4 weeks before the auction. The hammer could come down under standard auction terms, which is 28 days or 20 working days usually, although some auctions do use shorter terms, and sometimes individual lots in auction use a specifically shorter term, especially if there are LPA receivers or similar involved in the transaction. 7-day is not necessarily uncommon. But anyway, before the auction house might well be that the auction house would love to sell 30 to 40% of their lots before they even get in the room, because then they're guaranteed a successful auction on paper. And the stats are very important to them. And there's also been a fair bit of stat manipulation that's been going on in the new world post-COVID that I will explain to you. But you can imagine, as an auction house, if you sold 30 or 40% before you even lift the hammer, metaphorically, on the day, then you're pretty much guaranteed to be selling 70% of what you had on offer, if not more. So there's a good reason for the auction house. And so when you're looking at bidding pre-auction, you might well be looking for stuff that's been listed early. You might well be putting a bid in. One of the things you normally struggle with is justifying why you aren't going to be bidding at the auction. But I'd suggest you come up with a credible reason for that. Perhaps you just aren't going to bother because some of these online auctions take 12 or 13 hours, and you're not going to do it. Perhaps you're interested in 10 or 15 lots, but you're not going to transfer 10 or 15 deposits to the client account of the auction house just on the off chance that you might win them all. So it's competitive. By the time the auction comes around, here's one good piece of advice and a tactic that I've used before myself. You might be saying, well, do you know what? By the time the auction comes around, I might have already spent the money on something else. That's why I'm bidding today. This is my offer. If the vendor wants a nice, quick, clean, easy sale by auction terms, then they better take it. So that's pre. And you might also bid a day, an hour a day, 12 hours before the auction. Why would you bid so close to the auction? Because A, the auction house have just been phoning around all their clients trying to get them to drop the prices, especially if there isn't very much interest. And B, the vendor gets jittery just before the auction, especially if they're a first-time vendor at auction, which many auction lots are sold by people who it's their first time selling at an auction. So that's a bit about pre. Then we've got at the auction. Again, game's changed a little bit these days because quite often you're not in a physical room anymore. I would quite liken it to playing poker. There's a lot of difference between playing poker on the internet and playing poker live. When you're live, you can look at people, you can pick up tells. That's exactly the same in the auction room. And you can look at people who are perhaps I've seen before families with small children, for example. You can be fairly sure they're not professional property traders or investors. They're probably trying to buy a family home. What clue does that give you? You're probably not going to be able to compete, and they may well have deeper pockets and are not necessarily making a sensible investment decision, but quite an emotional purchase, for example. So in the auction room, when I'm in the room, I like to stand by the side of the room so that I can see backwards and forwards and see everything that's going on with my back against the wall, so I can see, apart from anything else, when the auctioneer might be doing what's called chandelier bidding, which is where they're bidding up to the reserve, and they're quite legitimately allowed to do that under the RICS common conditions of auction. So as long as you're bidding, then myself as the auctioneer can legally bid you up to the reserve to try and create some action. So you have to be aware of things like that. On the internet it's different. Obviously, what can you tell? You can tell from how long or short the pauses are between bids. If bids are getting smashed over very, very quickly, unfortunately that lot's probably going to race away completely, and you could ideally try and do with slowing it down, which is difficult to do. I always tend to wait quite late on in the process if I'm bidding online, just to make sure that it keeps everything as calm as possible and it stretches it out, because it gives the other side a chance to have a think that they might be making a mistake, and potentially stop bidding. And of course, another way to do that, another way to send a message, is to use what we call a knockout bid. So perhaps you try and knock out the competition by, when the auction is, let's say it's going up in £1,000 increments, you offer £5,000 more. And that makes people go, whoa, okay, this person seems prepared to go way, way high. I'm not going to compete against them, so I'll just leave it. And knockout bids can sometimes be pretty useful. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about post-auction. So lots that haven't sold. Why have they not sold, and what do you do about it? Now, some of those will just be the price. They've been priced a bit too high. Maybe the auctioneer was hard up for stock in the auction and they let them go in a bit high. Maybe the auctioneer just didn't price it quite correctly, keenly and competitively enough. Sometimes there's a problem that people don't think they can solve, and those are the ones that can be really quite interesting. I'll give you an example of one I bought that had a proceeds of crime order attached to it. And there was a lot of confusion between the CPS and the Land Registry on who was in charge of removing that proceeds of crime. But the process was as simple as long as I didn't know the vendor and there wasn't anything strange going on, and I was buying back a property and there'd been money laundering involved and all the rest of it, and I could quite easily prove that I didn't know the vendor as from a long way away geographically, no relations, no name, no mutual friends or connections on Facebook or anything like that. So the CPS and the Land Reg were both happy, and because that restriction was there on the title, the CPS restriction, it meant that I think probably a few people passed over that or just thought it was too difficult. The other thing you can try and do post-auction is change the structure of a deal. So perhaps, especially when you're talking about something that involves development, it might well be the case that you can't do it under auction terms, because perhaps you need to get some planning, perhaps you need to speak to conservation officers and heritage consultants if it's listed. There's all sorts of reasons why that might happen, and you just go back and say, listen, I can't do this under auction terms, I need to take it back to what's called private treaty, or I can do it under auction terms, but instead of 28 days, I need 3 months, or I need to slip in what we call a conditional exchange. So I'm exchanging and then I'll complete on the basis that this happens. So, for example, condition might be vacant possession, and it might not be vacant at the moment, but you might only want it if it's vacant and not be willing to buy it and do all that legwork and take all that extra risk yourself, because the price you pay has to reflect the risk you take, of course. So that's 9 minutes on auction. I hope you've enjoyed it. I could go on for a lot longer about that, but these videos are all there to be under 10 minutes long, and tune in next week for next week 4 pillars. Thank you.